My name is Plato. Perhaps you have heard my name mentioned many times.
As a young man, I sought truth in the streets of Athens, observing men and ideas moving like shadows on a wall. Then I met Socrates, and everything changed. He showed me that true wisdom comes from recognizing our ignorance. Close your eyes, let me take you on a journey through the memories of a life dedicated to thought.
Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we embark on a journey through the golden age of ancient Athens to discover the life of one of history's most profound thinkers. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let yourself drift back more than 2,000 years to a world of marble columns gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, to streets filled with the voices of merchants and philosophers, to a time when the foundations of Western thought were being laid, stone by philosophical stone. This is the story of Plato, the man who would reshape how humanity understands reality itself. Picture, if you will, the city of Athens in the year 428 before the Common Era. The air is warm and fragrant with olive blossoms. The Acropolis rises majestically above the city, its temples still new and brilliant white against the azure sky. In one of the finest homes in the city, a child is born to an aristocratic family of considerable wealth and influence. This child, given the name Plato, enters a world teetering between glory and conflict, between the heights of cultural achievement and the depths of war. Plato's family traced its lineage back through generations of Athenian nobility. Through his mother, Periceione, he was descended from Solon, the legendary lawgiver who had helped establish the foundations of Athenian democracy more than a century before. His father, Ariston, claimed descent from the ancient kings of Athens and, according to legend, from Poseidon himself, god of the seas. These were not mere boasts in ancient Athens, where family lineage carried immense social and political weight. Young Plato grew up surrounded by privilege, culture, and the expectation that he would one day play a significant role in the affairs of his city. The Athens of Plato's childhood was a city of contrasts and contradictions. It was the cultural center of the Greek world, a place where art, drama, poetry, and philosophy flourished as never before. The great playwright Sophocles was still writing his tragedies. The historian Thucydides was chronicling the events of the age. The Parthenon, that magnificent temple to Athena, had been completed just a few years before Plato's birth, its perfect proportions and exquisite sculptures representing the pinnacle of human artistic achievement. Yet, this same Athens was locked in a brutal and exhausting war with Sparta and its allies, a conflict that would eventually drain the city of its wealth, its power, and countless lives. Young Plato received the education befitting a boy of his class and station. He studied gymnastics, learning to develop his body through wrestling and other athletic pursuits. According to ancient sources, he was given the nickname Plato, meaning broad or wide, either because of his broad shoulders developed through wrestling, or perhaps his broad forehead, or even the breadth of his intellect and style of expression. His birth name may have been Aristocles, though modern scholars debate this detail. Whatever the truth of his nickname's origin, the name Plato would become synonymous with philosophical thought itself. His education extended far beyond physical training. He learned music, training his ear to appreciate harmony and rhythm, skills the Greeks believed essential for developing a well-ordered soul. He studied poetry, memorizing the great works of Homer and learning to appreciate the power of language and story. He learned mathematics and geometry, subjects that would later play a crucial role in his philosophical system. Young Plato showed such promise in literature that he began writing poetry himself, crafting dithyrambs, lyric poems, and even tragedies. Some sources suggest he was preparing to enter one of Athens' dramatic competitions, hoping to win fame as a playwright. The Peloponnesian War cast a long shadow over Plato's formative years. This brutal conflict between Athens and Sparta, which had begun in 431 BCE, would continue until 404 BCE, encompassing nearly all of Plato's youth. Two of his older brothers, Adimantus and Glaucon, distinguished themselves in battle at Megara in 409 BCE. Plato himself likely served in the Athenian military, possibly participating in campaigns at Tanagra, Corinth, and Delium, experiencing firsthand the violence and chaos of war. These experiences would later inform his political philosophy, particularly his skepticism about the ability of ordinary citizens to govern wisely. When Plato's father Ariston died during his childhood, his mother Periceione remarried her uncle Pyrilampus, a prominent politician and ambassador to Persia. This gave young Plato even closer connections to Athens' political elite and provided him with a stepfather who moved in the highest circles of power. Plato grew up observing the workings of Athenian democracy from an insider's perspective, watching as demagogues swayed the assembly, as popular opinion shifted like the wind, and as decisions were made based more on rhetoric and emotion than on reason and wisdom. These observations would profoundly shape his later skepticism about democracy as a form of government. But the most transformative event of Plato's youth, the encounter that would redirect the entire course of his life, came when he met a peculiar older man who spent his days wandering the streets of Athens, engaging citizens in philosophical conversation. This man was Socrates, and their meeting would change not only Plato's life but the entire trajectory of Western philosophy. Socrates was unlike anyone Plato had ever encountered. Where other teachers charged fees and promised to teach wisdom, Socrates claimed to know nothing and charged no fees at all. Where the sophists taught the art of persuasive speech without regard for truth, Socrates insisted on rigorous logical examination of every claim. Where others sought power and influence, Socrates seemed content to question the assumptions of the powerful. He was a curious figure, often described as physically unprepossessing, with a snub nose and bulging eyes, walking barefoot through Athens in the same simple cloak regardless of season, stopping people in the marketplace or at the gymnasium to engage them in dialogue. The Socratic method, as it came to be known, was deceptively simple. Socrates would approach someone who claimed expertise in some area: justice, courage, piety, beauty, and begin asking questions. What is justice? Can you define it? He would listen to their answer, then ask more questions, gently probing for contradictions and inconsistencies. Through this process of questioning and examination, he would demonstrate that the person's understanding was incomplete or contradictory, that they did not truly possess the knowledge they claimed to have. The goal was not to humiliate, but to promote genuine understanding, to move from false certainty to the recognition of ignorance, which Socrates believed was the first step toward true wisdom. According to tradition, when young Plato heard Socrates speak, something profound stirred within him. Some accounts say he was in his late teens or early 20s, already embarking on a career as a poet and playwright. Upon encountering Socrates and hearing his philosophical method, Plato is said to have destroyed all his poems and plays, abandoning his literary ambitions to devote himself entirely to philosophy. Whether this dramatic story is literally true or not, it captures something essential about the impact Socrates had on his young follower. Plato had found his true calling. For the next several years, Plato became one of Socrates' most devoted disciples, part of the circle of young men who gathered around the philosopher to listen, learn, and engage in dialogue. He observed how Socrates questioned the most prominent citizens of Athens, how he exposed the emptiness of those who claimed to be wise, how he pursued truth with unwavering dedication regardless of the consequences. Socrates taught not through formal instruction but through conversation, through the careful examination of ideas, through the relentless pursuit of logical consistency. He believed that virtue was knowledge, that no one does wrong willingly, and that the unexamined life is not worth living. Plato absorbed not just Socrates' methods but his values. The older philosopher taught that the care of the soul was more important than the accumulation of wealth or power. He demonstrated through his own life that one should be willing to face any hardship, even death, rather than act unjustly or abandon one's principles. He showed that philosophy was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a way of life, a commitment to living according to reason and virtue. These lessons would form the bedrock of Plato's own philosophical vision. But Athens was changing. The long war with Sparta finally ended in 404 BCE with Athens' complete defeat. The victorious Spartans imposed a brutal oligarchy on the city, a government of 30 tyrants who ruled through fear and violence. Two of these tyrants, Critias and Charmides, were relatives of Plato himself, and both had been associates of Socrates. When this regime of terror fell and democracy was restored, suspicion fell upon Socrates. Had he not taught and influenced those who had become tyrants? Did his questioning of democratic values not undermine the very foundations of Athenian society? In 399 BCE, when Plato was around 28 years old, the event occurred that would scar him for life and fundamentally alter his relationship with Athens and politics. Socrates was brought to trial on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. The accusers claimed he did not believe in the city's gods but introduced new spiritual beings, and that he corrupted young men by teaching them to question authority and tradition. The trial was conducted before a jury of 500 Athenian citizens, as was customary for serious charges. Plato was present at the trial. One of the few events from Socrates' life he personally witnessed and later documented in his dialogue: the apology. He watched as his beloved teacher stood before the jury and delivered a defense that was, paradoxically, both brilliant and calculated to provoke. Socrates did not beg for mercy, as was expected. Instead, he defended his way of life, explaining that he had received a divine mission to question and examine the citizens of Athens, to act as a kind of gadfly stinging the sluggish horse of the state into wakefulness. He stated that an unexamined life was not worth living, that he would never cease his philosophical activity even if ordered to do so, and that far from corrupting the youth, he had been trying to get them to care for wisdom and truth above all else. The jury found Socrates guilty by a relatively narrow margin. According to Athenian law, both the prosecution and the defendant could propose punishments, and the jury would choose between them. The prosecutors proposed death. When it came time for Socrates to propose a counter penalty, he suggested, with apparent seriousness mixed with irony, that he should be given free meals at public expense for the rest of his life, as was granted to Olympic victors and other public benefactors. This was not the humble plea for exile or a fine that the jury might have accepted. Eventually, after his friend's urging, he offered to pay a fine, but the damage was done. The jury, now more angered than before, voted by a larger margin for the death penalty. Plato and other friends visited Socrates during his final days in prison. According to Plato's later account in the dialogue Phaedo, they found their teacher calm and cheerful, more concerned with discussing philosophy than with his impending death. Socrates spent his last hours discussing the immortality of the soul, arguing that death was not to be feared by a philosopher because it would finally free the soul from the limitations and distractions of the body. He reasoned that philosophy itself was a preparation for death, a practice of separating the soul from bodily concerns and focusing on pure truth and wisdom. When the time came, Socrates drank the cup of hemlock poison with steady hands. As the numbness spread through his body, he continued conversing with his friends, remaining composed and rational until the very end. His last words, according to Plato's account, were to remind one of his friends to pay a debt of a rooster owed to the god of healing, Asclepius. Then the great philosopher closed his eyes and died. Plato would later write that Socrates was the wisest, most just, and best man he had ever known. The execution of Socrates devastated Plato. The injustice of it, the fact that the Democratic Assembly had condemned the wisest man in Athens, shattered any remaining faith Plato might have had in democracy as a system of government. How could a political system that allowed such an outcome be considered just? How could the opinions of the many, who lacked wisdom and virtue, be trusted to govern? The tragedy of Socrates' death would inform all of Plato's subsequent political philosophy, his conviction that only the wise should rule, his skepticism about the ability of ordinary people to make sound political decisions. After Socrates' death, Plato left Athens. Perhaps he feared for his own safety, given his close association with the condemned philosopher. Perhaps he needed to escape the painful memories that haunted every street and corner of the city where his teacher had walked and talked. Whatever the reason, Plato embarked on a period of travel that would last approximately 12 years and take him across the Mediterranean world, exposing him to different cultures, ideas, and ways of organizing society. Plato first traveled to Megara, a city-state not far from Athens, where he stayed with Euclid, another student of Socrates who had founded a philosophical school. From there, his journeys took him to Cyrene in North Africa, where he studied mathematics with Theodorus, a Pythagorean philosopher who would later appear as a character in some of Plato's dialogues. He traveled to Egypt, where the ancient civilization with its priest-kings and stable, conservative society provided yet another model of social organization for him to observe and consider. But the most influential phase of Plato's travels came when he journeyed to southern Italy and Sicily, regions heavily influenced by Pythagoreanism. Pythagoras, who had lived more than a century earlier, had founded a philosophical and religious movement that combined mathematics, music, mysticism, and strict ethical precepts. The Pythagoreans believed that number was the fundamental reality underlying all things, that the cosmos was ordered according to mathematical principles, and that the soul was immortal and underwent reincarnation. They lived in communities bound by strict rules, practicing vegetarianism, studying mathematics and music, and seeking to purify their souls through philosophical contemplation. In southern Italy, Plato met Archytas of Tarentum, a Pythagorean philosopher, mathematician, statesman, and general who was widely respected throughout the Greek world. Archytas was precisely the kind of figure Plato would later idealize, a philosopher who successfully engaged in practical politics, ruling his city-state with wisdom and maintaining its independence and prosperity. Their friendship would last for many years, and Archytas likely served as one model for Plato's concept of the philosopher king. Through Archytas and other Pythagoreans, Plato deepened his understanding of mathematics and its philosophical implications. He became convinced that mathematics provided a model for certain knowledge, and that geometric truths represented a kind of eternal reality beyond the changing material world. During this period, Plato also visited Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in Sicily, ruled by the tyrant Dionysius I. This visit introduced Plato to the messy realities of practical politics and began his long, complicated, and ultimately frustrating relationship with the Syracusan court. He met Dion, the brother-in-law of Dionysius, an intelligent and cultured man who became devoted to philosophy and to Plato personally. The contrast between the philosopher's vision of how society should be organized and the reality of tyrannical rule was stark. According to some accounts, Plato's outspoken philosophical views offended Dionysius, and the philosopher was sold into slavery, only to be ransomed by friends. Whether this dramatic story is true or embellished, it symbolizes the dangers Plato faced when philosophical truth confronted political power. Throughout his travels, Plato was not merely observing and learning. He was also thinking, synthesizing, and beginning to develop his own philosophical vision that would go far beyond anything Socrates had taught. He was pondering questions that had occupied Greek philosophers for generations. What is real? How do we know anything? What makes actions right or wrong? How should society be organized? What is justice? What is the good life for a human being? These questions, which Socrates had pursued through dialogue and questioning, Plato began to answer through an elaborate philosophical system that would eventually be known as the theory of forms. By around 387 BCE, when Plato was approximately 40 years old, he returned to Athens. He had been transformed by his experiences. The young man who had left Athens in grief and disillusionment had become a mature philosopher with a fully developed vision of reality and how human life should be lived. He had witnessed different forms of government, studied with mathematicians and Pythagoreans, observed the successes and failures of various political systems, and spent years in deep contemplation of philosophical problems. Now, he was ready to establish something lasting, something that would ensure the philosophical inquiry Socrates had begun would continue for future generations. Upon his return to Athens, Plato purchased land in a grove of trees sacred to the hero Academus, located about a mile northwest of the city walls. This area, known as the Academy, had long been used for athletic training and religious ceremonies. Here, Plato established what is often considered the first university in the Western world, a school that would continue, in various forms, for nearly 900 years, until it was finally closed by the Christian emperor Justinian in 529 CE. This was not merely a school in the modern sense, but a complex institution combining research, teaching, religious worship, and communal living. The Academy was legally organized as a religious association devoted to the Muses, the goddesses of the arts and sciences. This legal structure allowed it to own property and continue as an institution beyond Plato's lifetime. The school had residential facilities where students could live, a library containing manuscripts and texts, gardens for walking and contemplation, and spaces for lectures and discussions. Students came from throughout the Greek world, drawn by Plato's reputation and the opportunity to engage in philosophical and mathematical studies at the highest level. The education offered at the Academy was demanding and comprehensive. Plato believed that proper philosophical training required years of preparation and should only be undertaken by those with the right nature and abilities. According to tradition, an inscription above the Academy's entrance read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Whether this inscription actually existed or not, it captures something essential about Plato's educational philosophy. He believed that mathematics, particularly geometry, was essential training for philosophers because it dealt with eternal truths and trained the mind to move beyond the changing world of sense experience to grasp unchanging realities. The curriculum at the Academy combined practical subjects with theoretical ones. Students studied mathematics, including arithmetic, geometry, solid geometry, astronomy viewed as the geometry of moving objects, and harmonics viewed as the mathematics of musical relations. They studied dialectic, the art of logical argumentation, and the careful definition of concepts. They engaged in detailed discussions of ethical and political questions, examining concepts like justice, virtue, courage, and wisdom. They studied physics and cosmology, considering questions about the nature and origin of the physical world. All of this was pursued not merely as academic knowledge, but as preparation for living the good life and, ideally, for becoming capable of wise leadership in political affairs. The teaching methods at the Academy reflected Plato's philosophical principles and his memories of Socrates. Rather than simply lecturing and expecting students to memorize information, teachers engaged students in dialogue, posed problems to be solved, and encouraged independent thinking and logical argumentation. Students were expected to defend their positions and to subject their own beliefs to rigorous examination. The goal was not to indoctrinate, but to develop the ability to think clearly and to discover truth through reason. One of the Academy's most famous students arrived in 367 BCE when he was 17 years old. His name was Aristotle, and he would remain at the Academy for 20 years, first as a student and then as a teacher and researcher. The relationship between Plato and Aristotle was complex. Aristotle deeply respected his teacher, calling him the man whom it is not right for the wicked even to praise. Yet Aristotle was no mere follower. He developed his own philosophical system that would eventually challenge many of Plato's key doctrines. Plato reportedly called Aristotle the mind, or the reader, recognizing his students' extraordinary intellectual abilities and his voracious appetite for learning. When Aristotle finally left the Academy after Plato's death, He would go on to found his own school, the Lyceum, and his influence on Western thought would rival even Plato's own. But the Academy was more than just a school. It was a research institution where scholars pursued advanced studies in mathematics and science. Theaetetus, the mathematician who made important contributions to the theory of irrational numbers and discovered two of the 5 regular solids, was associated with the Academy. Eudoxus of Cnidus, one of the greatest mathematicians and astronomers of antiquity, worked at the Academy for several years, developing a sophisticated astronomical theory that would influence thinking about the heavens for centuries. Philip of Opus, who served as Plato's secretary and may have edited or completed some of his works, was himself an accomplished mathematician and astronomer. The Academy also served as a kind of think tank or consulting service for cities throughout the Greek world. Various city-states, seeking to reform their laws or constitutions, would appeal to the Academy for advice. Plato sent several of his students to assist in such projects, hoping that they could apply philosophical principles to practical political problems. This reflected Plato's conviction that philosophy should not remain purely theoretical, but should engage with the real world, that philosophers had a responsibility to improve society if they could. During these years at the Academy, Plato was also writing. Unlike Socrates, who wrote nothing, Plato composed extensive works that have survived through the centuries. He developed a distinctive literary form, the philosophical dialogue, which allowed him to present philosophical ideas not as abstract treatises, but as living conversations between characters. Most of his dialogues feature Socrates as the main character, though the Socrates in these later dialogues often expresses views that the historical Socrates likely never held. Through these dialogues, Plato could present complex arguments, explore objections and counter-arguments, and bring philosophical ideas to life in a way that pure exposition could not. The most distinctive and influential element of Plato's philosophy was his theory of forms, sometimes also called the theory of ideas. This theory represents Plato's attempt to solve fundamental philosophical problems that had vexed Greek thinkers for generations. How can we have certain knowledge in a world where everything is constantly changing? How can we explain the fact that many different things can all be examples of the same type? How can we account for the apparent standards of beauty, justice, and goodness that seem to stand above particular beautiful, just, or good things? Plato's answer was to propose the existence of 2 distinct levels of reality. The world we experience through our senses, the world of physical objects and everyday experience, is merely the world of appearances. It is a realm of constant change, imperfection, and multiplicity. Nothing in this physical world is permanent. Everything comes into being and passes away. No physical object is perfectly beautiful, perfectly circular, or perfectly just. This physical world, Plato argued, is like a shadow or reflection of a higher reality. The true reality, according to Plato, is the world of forms. The forms are perfect, eternal, unchanging, non-physical entities that exist beyond space and time. There is a form of beauty itself, not any particular beautiful thing, but beauty as such, the perfect standard by which all beautiful things can be judged beautiful. There is a form of circularity, the perfect circle that geometers study, which no physical circle ever quite matches. There are forms of justice, goodness, courage, piety, and every other quality. There are even forms of natural kinds, a form of horse, a form of tree, a form of human being. The relationship between the world of forms and the physical world is complex. Plato sometimes describes physical objects as participating in or partaking of the forms. A beautiful painting is beautiful because it participates in the form of beauty. A circular wheel is circular because it participates in the form of circularity. Physical objects are like imperfect copies of the perfect originals, the forms. Or they are like shadows cast by real objects, dim and distorted reflections of a higher reality. The forms are the patterns or paradigms, and physical objects are the imperfect, changing instances. This theory had profound implications for Plato's epistemology, his theory of knowledge. If physical objects are constantly changing and imperfect, they cannot be the objects of true knowledge, only of opinion or belief. True knowledge can only be of what is stable and perfect, namely the forms. When we truly know something, we are grasping not the physical, changing thing itself, but the eternal form that it imperfectly embodies. The goal of education, then, is to turn the soul away from the changing physical world and toward the unchanging world of forms. But how do we gain knowledge of the forms if they are non-physical and beyond sense experience? Plato's answer involves his doctrine of recollection. He argued that the soul existed before it entered the body, and, in its pre-embodied state, had direct acquaintance with the forms. When we are born, we forget this knowledge, but it remains buried in the soul. Learning, then, is actually a process of remembering, of recollecting what the soul once knew but has forgotten. This explains how we can recognize instances of concepts like equality or beauty, even though we have never encountered perfect equality or perfect beauty in the physical world. We are remembering the forms of equality and beauty that our souls once knew. Plato developed several arguments for the theory of forms and the doctrine of recollection. In his dialogue, Meno, Socrates demonstrates how an uneducated slave boy can be led, through questioning, to discover geometric truths he was never taught, suggesting that this knowledge was already within him, waiting to be recalled. In the Phaedo, Plato argues that our recognition of the imperfection of physical objects presupposes knowledge of perfect standards, the forms, which we must have known before birth. In the Republic, he contends that the forms are necessary to explain how we can have knowledge and how we can make meaningful judgments about things. At the pinnacle of Plato's hierarchy of forms stands the form of the good. This is the highest form, the source of truth and being for all other forms. Plato compared the form of the good to the sun. Just as the sun in the visible world provides light that makes visible objects perceptible and provides the energy that sustains life, so the form of the good in the intelligible world makes the forms knowable and provides the reality that sustains their being. To grasp the form of the good is the ultimate goal of philosophical education and the prerequisite for true wisdom. Plato illustrated his theory of forms through his famous allegory of the cave, presented in the Republic. Imagine, he asks us, a group of prisoners who have been chained in a dark cave since childhood, facing a wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners, having never seen anything else, mistake these shadows for reality itself. They give names to the shadows, develop expertise in predicting which shadow will appear next, and believe themselves to be knowledgeable about the world. Now, suppose one prisoner is freed and turned around. At first, the firelight hurts his eyes. The actual objects whose shadows he had been watching seem less real than the familiar shadows. Gradually, his eyes adjust, and he realizes that what he thought was real was merely shadow, and these objects illuminated by firelight are more real. Then, suppose he is dragged up a steep and difficult path out of the cave into the sunlight. The brilliant light is overwhelming, painful. Gradually, his eyes adjust. First, he can see reflections in water, then objects themselves, then the sky at night, and finally the sun itself, the source of all light and life. This freed prisoner represents the philosopher who has ascended from ignorance to knowledge, from the world of changing appearances to the world of eternal forms, and finally to the form of the good itself, the sun of the intelligible realm. If this enlightened person returns to the cave to free the other prisoners, they will think him mad, his vision ruined. They will prefer their comfortable illusions to the difficult journey toward truth. This allegory captures both the difficulty of philosophical education and the responsibility of those who achieve wisdom to try to help others, even if their efforts are rejected or punished. The theory of forms was not merely an abstract metaphysical doctrine for Plato. It had profound implications for ethics and politics. If there are objective forms of virtue, justice, and the good, then ethical and political questions have real answers, not merely matters of opinion or convention. The goal of ethics is to understand these forms and to order one's soul in accordance with them. The goal of politics is to organize society in accord with the form of justice. This brings us to Plato's political philosophy, most fully expressed in his dialogue, The Republic. This work, written in his middle period, is one of the most influential texts in the history of political thought, though one of the most controversial. Ostensibly a discussion of justice, The Republic presents Plato's vision of an ideal city-state, a society organized according to philosophical principles and ruled by wisdom rather than by wealth or popular opinion. Plato begins the Republic by asking what justice is. After considering and rejecting several proposed definitions, Socrates suggests that it will be easier to understand justice in an individual's soul if they first examine justice in a city, which is like a soul writ large. He then proceeds to construct in speech an ideal city from scratch, starting from first principles about human needs and natural divisions of labor. Plato's ideal city has three distinct classes, corresponding to three parts of the soul that he identifies. The largest class consists of the producers, farmers, craftspeople, merchants, those who create the material necessities of life. They correspond to the appetitive part of the soul, which desires food, drink, physical pleasure, and material goods. The second class consists of the guardians or auxiliaries, warriors who defend the city from external threats and maintain internal order. They correspond to the spirited part of the soul, which desires honor, glory, and victory. The smallest class consists of the rulers, philosophers who govern with wisdom. They correspond to the rational part of the soul, which desires truth and understanding. Justice in the city, Plato argues, consists in each class performing its proper function and not interfering with the others. The producers should produce, The guardians should guard, and the rulers should rule. Justice in an individual soul is analogous. The appetites should be controlled. The spirited part should support reason, and reason should govern the whole personality. An unjust city or soul is one where the wrong element rules, where appetite or spirit rather than reason directs action. But who should these rulers be? This is where Plato introduces his most famous and most controversial political proposal, the concept of the philosopher king. He argues that the rulers of the ideal city must be philosophers, people who have undergone decades of rigorous education culminating in the direct apprehension of the form of the good. Only those who truly understand what goodness is can govern wisely and justly. Only those who care more for wisdom than for wealth or power can be trusted to rule in the interest of the whole community, rather than for personal gain. Plato was fully aware of how radical and paradoxical this proposal would seem to his contemporaries. The very idea of philosophers as political rulers would strike most Athenians as absurd or laughable. Philosophers were often seen as impractical dreamers, people who wasted their time on abstract speculation rather than engaging with real-world concerns. How could such people possibly govern a city effectively? Yet Plato insists that this paradox must be resolved. Cities will have no rest from troubles, he writes, until philosophers become kings, or until those who are now called kings become genuine philosophers, until political power and philosophical wisdom coincide in the same person. Why must rulers be philosophers? Because only philosophers can know the form of the good, and only with such knowledge can one truly understand what is best for individuals and for society. The philosopher has ascended from the cave of ignorance into the light of true knowledge. Having seen the sun, having grasped the form of the good, the philosopher knows what genuine goodness is, not merely what seems good or what people happen to desire. This knowledge makes the philosopher uniquely qualified to determine what laws and institutions will genuinely benefit the city. Moreover, philosophers are the only people who can be trusted with power because they are the only ones who do not want it. Most people seek political power from love of wealth, honor, or domination. They will use power to enrich themselves or glorify themselves, not to benefit the community. But the philosopher, having tasted the pure pleasure of contemplating eternal truths, finds the rewards of political office paltry in comparison. The philosopher would prefer to spend all his time in philosophical contemplation. He enters politics only from a sense of duty, recognizing that he owes a debt to the city that educated him. Paradoxically, this reluctance to rule is precisely what makes the philosopher fit to rule. Plato's ideal city includes many features that strike modern readers as either admirable or disturbing, depending on one's perspective. The guardian class lives communally, without private property or private families. This is meant to prevent conflicts of interest and to ensure that guardians identify completely with the city rather than with any particular family or interest group. Women, if they have the right nature and abilities, can be guardians and even rulers, a surprisingly progressive view for ancient Greece. The city carefully controls what stories and music young guardians are exposed to, recognizing the power of culture to shape character. Education is the central concern of the state, because creating people with the right character is essential to maintaining a just society. Yet the Republic also contains elements that trouble many readers. The city engages in what we might call eugenics, controlling reproduction among the guardian class to breed people with the best natures. It practices what Plato calls a noble lie, telling citizens a myth about their origins designed to make them accept their place in society's hierarchy. It censors poetry and drama, banishing certain forms of art that might corrupt citizens' souls. It leaves little room for individual freedom as modern people understand it. The common good, as determined by the wise rulers, takes absolute precedence over individual desires and plans. Is Plato's Republic meant to be a practical blueprint for an actual society? Scholars have debated this question for centuries. Some argue that Plato genuinely believed such a city could be established, if the right circumstances arose. Others contend that the Republic is primarily a thought experiment, an exploration of what perfect justice would look like, meant to illuminate the nature of justice and the soul, rather than to serve as a practical political program. Plato himself, through Socrates, seems ambivalent. He suggests that the ideal city is a pattern laid up in heaven, a standard against which actual cities can be measured, even if it never exists on earth. In Books 8 and 9 of the Republic, Plato examines imperfect forms of government, showing how each degenerates into a worse form. The ideal aristocracy, rule by the best, degenerates into timocracy, rule by those who love honor, which degenerates into oligarchy, rule by the wealthy, which degenerates into democracy, rule by the people, which finally degenerates into tyranny, rule by one person who enslaves everyone else for his own benefit. Plato's analysis of democracy is particularly revealing of his political concerns. He sees democracy as a system where everyone does what they want without any higher principle of order, where rulers pander to the desires of the masses rather than pursuing genuine good, where teachers fear students and there is no respect for wisdom or authority. Democracy, in Plato's view, contains the seeds of its own destruction and inevitably leads to tyranny when a demagogue arises who promises to give the people what they want and then enslaves them. This harsh view of democracy must be understood in the context of Plato's experience. He had lived through Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War, a defeat he might have attributed partly to bad democratic decision-making. He had witnessed the Athenian assembly make disastrous strategic decisions, condemn innocent generals, and ultimately vote to execute his beloved teacher Socrates. For Plato, these were not accidents or aberrations, but inevitable consequences of a system that gave political power to those who lacked the wisdom to use it well. Yet, we should not conclude that Plato simply advocated authoritarian rule by philosophers. His ideal rulers are constrained by their philosophical education and their knowledge of the good. They do not rule for personal benefit, but for the good of the whole community. They are more like reluctant servants of the common good than like absolute monarchs, and Plato recognizes that such ideal rulers are extraordinarily rare. In his later dialogue, Laws, written when he was an old man, Plato presents a more realistic political vision, describing a city governed by detailed laws rather than by philosopher kings, with more conventional institutions and more room for citizen participation. While Plato was developing his philosophical and political theories at the Academy, he continued to have involvement with practical politics, particularly in Syracuse. In 367 BCE, Dionysius I died, and his young son, Dionysius II, inherited power. Dion, Plato's old friend from his first visit to Syracuse, saw an opportunity. He invited Plato to come to Syracuse and educate the young tyrant, hoping to transform him into Plato's philosopher king. Despite considerable skepticism about the prospects for success, Plato agreed to make the journey. He was now in his 60s, but he felt obligated to try. If his philosophical theories were to have any practical impact, if there was any chance of seeing a philosopher ruler in his lifetime, he could not refuse the opportunity. The venture was a disaster from the start. Dionysius II was no philosopher. He was jealous, suspicious, and more interested in maintaining power than in pursuing wisdom. Within months, he had Dion exiled from Syracuse on charges of conspiracy. Plato himself became essentially a prisoner at the tyrant's court, forbidden to leave. Only after considerable diplomatic effort, with the help of his friend Archytas of Tarentum, did Plato manage to extract himself from Syracuse and return to Athens. But the story was not quite over. Dionysius claimed to be interested in philosophy and promised that if Plato would return, he would allow Dion to return as well. In 361 BCE, Plato made a third visit to Syracuse, now in his late 60s, still hoping that somehow philosophy and political power might be reconciled. Again, the mission failed. Dionysius used Plato as a kind of intellectual ornament to his court, but had no intention of actually governing as a philosopher king or of bringing Dion back from exile. Eventually, Plato returned to Athens, his hopes of creating a philosopher king definitively disappointed. Dion would later return to Syracuse by force, leading an army of mercenaries to overthrow Dionysius II in 357 BCE. For a brief period, it seemed that a philosopher might indeed rule the city. But Dion was assassinated within a few years, and Syracuse descended into chaos. The entire episode must have been profoundly disillusioning for Plato. His philosophical vision of enlightened rule by the wise had collided with the messy, violent realities of power politics and personal ambition. Plato returned to his academy and devoted his final years to teaching, writing, and running the school. He continued to refine his philosophical positions, and his later dialogues show him grappling with criticisms of his theory of forms and exploring new problems. In the Parmenides, he presents powerful objections to the theory of forms through the character of Parmenides, the great pre-Socratic philosopher. How can a form be both one and many? How can it be separate from the physical things that partake of it, yet somehow present in them? These are deep problems, and scholars debate whether Plato thought he had resolved them. In the Theaetetus, Plato examines the nature of knowledge, considering and rejecting several proposed definitions. In the Sophist and Statesman, he explores questions about being and non-being, and about the nature of political expertise. In the Philebus, he analyzes the relationship between pleasure and the good life. And in his longest and last dialogue, The Laws, he presents a detailed vision of a city governed not by philosopher kings, but by good laws, a more realistic political model that acknowledges the rarity of genuine philosophers, while still trying to incorporate philosophical wisdom into political institutions. Throughout his later years, Plato continued to attract students to the academy from throughout the Greek world. He continued to write, his philosophical prose never losing its beauty and power. he continued to live simply, devoting himself to philosophical contemplation and discussion. According to ancient biographers, he never married and had no children, dedicating his entire life to philosophy and his students. The exact circumstances of Plato's death are uncertain. He died around 347 or 346 BCE at approximately 80 years of age, a long life for ancient times. According to one tradition, he died peacefully at a wedding feast. According to another, he died quietly in his sleep. He was reportedly buried in the grounds of the Academy, though his grave has never been found by archaeologists. After his death, his nephew Speusippus became head of the Academy, and the institution continued for centuries, going through various transformations and reinterpretations of Plato's philosophy. What was Plato's legacy? It would be difficult to overstate his influence on subsequent Western thought. The 20th century philosopher Alfred North Whitehead famously remarked that the safest characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. This was not mere hyperbole. Plato established philosophy as we know it, as a rigorous, systematic inquiry into the most fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, ethics, and politics. His theory of forms, despite being challenged and modified by countless philosophers over the centuries, established a way of thinking about abstract objects and universals that remains central to metaphysics. His epistemology, with its emphasis on reason over sense experience as the path to genuine knowledge, shaped centuries of philosophical thought. His ethics, centered on the care of the soul and the pursuit of virtue, influenced not just philosophy, but the development of Christianity and other religious traditions. His political philosophy, with its emphasis on justice, the rule of law, and the importance of education, continues to provoke debate and reflection. Plato's literary achievement was equally significant. He demonstrated that philosophy could be presented in beautiful prose, that abstract ideas could be brought to life through dialogue and character. His dialogues are not merely philosophical arguments but works of literature, rich in metaphor, myth, and dramatic tension. They continue to be read not just by philosophers, but by anyone interested in fundamental questions about human life and society. Perhaps most importantly, Plato established the ideal of the philosophical life itself. He showed that there is a life dedicated to seeking truth, wisdom, and understanding, a life of examining assumptions, questioning received opinions, and pursuing knowledge wherever it leads. This life might not bring wealth or power, might even bring persecution and death as it did for Socrates. But it is, Plato believed, the most fully human life, the life most worth living. The Academy Plato founded became a model for educational institutions throughout history. Its emphasis on rigorous study, on mathematics as preparation for philosophy, on dialogue and discussion rather than mere rote learning, on pursuing knowledge for its own sake rather than for immediate practical application. All these became ideals for universities and centers of learning in later ages. Plato's influence extended beyond philosophy proper into virtually every domain of intellectual life. Early Christian theologians like Augustine found in Plato's philosophy, particularly the theory of forms, resources for articulating Christian doctrines about the relationship between the eternal God and the temporal world. Medieval Islamic and Jewish philosophers engaged deeply with Plato's political thought. seeing parallels between the philosopher king and their own religious conceptions of ideal leadership. Renaissance humanists rediscovered and celebrated Plato's works, finding in them an alternative to the Aristotelian scholasticism that had dominated medieval thought. In the modern period, philosophers from Descartes to Kant to contemporary metaphysicians have grappled with questions Plato first posed and have developed positions that either build upon or react against his answers. Political theorists continue to debate Plato's critique of democracy and his vision of a just society. Mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics still discuss Platonism, the view that mathematical objects exist in some ideal realm independent of human minds. Plato's allegory of the cave has become part of common cultural knowledge, a powerful metaphor for enlightenment and the difficulty of achieving true understanding. Yet Plato's legacy is not without controversy. His political philosophy, with its emphasis on rule by an elite and its critique of democracy and individual freedom, has been seen by some critics as providing intellectual justification for authoritarian regimes. His theory of forms, with its devaluation of the physical world in favor of an abstract realm of ideals, has been criticized for turning attention away from concrete human concerns and from the natural world. His epistemology, with its emphasis on innate knowledge and its skepticism about sense experience, has been challenged by empiricists who insist that all knowledge ultimately derives from experience. Feminist critics have noted that despite his relatively progressive views about women's potential as guardians and rulers, Plato's writings often reflect the sexist assumptions of his culture. His vision of the ideal city, with its control over private life and its subordination of the individual to the state, strikes many modern readers as dystopian rather than utopian. And there remains the fundamental question of how seriously we should take Plato's positive proposals, or whether his dialogues are better read as explorations that raise questions without definitively answering them. These debates and criticisms are themselves testament to Plato's enduring relevance. More than 2 millennia after his death, people still find his ideas worthy of serious engagement, whether to defend them, modify them, or argue against them. Few thinkers in human history have provoked such sustained attention and such diverse interpretations. As we reflect on Plato's life and thought, certain themes emerge. There is his unwavering commitment to the pursuit of truth, no matter where it leads or what conventional opinions must be questioned along the way. There is his conviction that genuine knowledge is possible, that reality has an intelligible structure that human reason can grasp. There is his belief that how we live matters, that ethics and politics are not mere matters of opinion, but have objective foundations. There is his vision of education as transformation, as turning the soul from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge. There is his courage in speaking truth to power, even when it proves dangerous. And there is his dedication to his students and to preserving and extending the philosophical conversation that Socrates began. If we could meet Plato today and ask him what message he would want to convey across the centuries, what might he say? Perhaps he would remind us that the unexamined life is not worth living, that we should question our assumptions and seek understanding rather than resting content with comfortable opinions. Perhaps he would urge us to care for our souls, to pursue wisdom and virtue rather than merely wealth and power. Perhaps he would encourage us to look beyond the shadows on the cave wall, to seek the deeper truths that lie beyond surface appearances. Perhaps he would insist that there are objective standards of justice and goodness, that these are not merely subjective preferences but realities we can discover through philosophical inquiry. And perhaps, most importantly, he would invite us to join the conversation, to take up the questions he raised and pursue them in our own way, with our own insights and in light of our own experiences. For Plato understood that philosophy is not a set of doctrines to be memorized, but an activity, an ongoing dialogue across generations, a shared quest for truth and understanding. His dialogues end not with definitive answers, but with invitations to continue thinking, questioning, and seeking. As you drift toward sleep, let your mind wander through the groves of the Academy, where generations of students gathered to pursue wisdom. Picture Plato in his later years, white-haired and serene, still teaching, still writing, still thinking about the eternal forms and the good life. Imagine the conversations that echoed through those gardens, as young people from across the Greek world engaged with the questions that Plato had devoted his life to exploring. Feel the continuity of human intellectual striving, the chain of teachers and students, questions and answers, stretching from ancient Athens to our own time. Plato showed us that the life of the mind matters, that pursuing understanding is a worthy dedication of a human life. He demonstrated that philosophy is not merely abstract speculation, but a way of living, a commitment to truth and virtue that can transform individuals and, perhaps, transform society. His vision of enlightened wisdom guiding human affairs remains an ideal, even if it has rarely been achieved in practice. His conviction that there is truth to be found, that reality has meaning and structure, offers hope in ages of confusion and relativism. Let Plato's example inspire your own pursuit of wisdom and understanding. Let his courage in questioning accepted opinions encourage you to think for yourself. Let his dedication to truth remind you that seeking knowledge is worth the effort, even when the path is difficult. Let his love for his teacher Socrates exemplify the transformative power of mentorship and philosophical friendship. Let his establishment of the Academy show the importance of institutions dedicated to learning and the free pursuit of truth. And now, as sleep approaches, let your thoughts become calm, like the still surface of a pond reflecting the stars above. Let the questions Plato raised float gently through your consciousness without demanding immediate answers. What is justice? What is the good life? What is truly real? What can we know with certainty? These ancient questions remain with us, and each generation must grapple with them anew. But for now, let them simply be, like old friends keeping you company as you drift into dreams. If you've enjoyed this journey through the life and thought of Plato, the philosopher whose ideas continue to shape our world more than 2,000 years after his death, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more explorations of history's greatest thinkers and most fascinating stories. Share this with anyone who might appreciate learning about the foundations of Western philosophy while drifting peacefully toward sleep. Your support helps us continue creating these relaxing, educational journeys through history. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with wisdom and wonder.